In 1978, a Portland sewer worker named Earl Whitcomb spent 43 years walking tunnels that the city said did not exist. He kept a notebook, he took photographs, he filed reports that nobody read. When he retired in 2002, he handed his entire collection to a local historian and told her one sentence before he walked out the door. Everything I saw down there was built by people who came before us, and the city has been pretending otherwise since the day I started. Earl Whitcomb died in 2018. His notebook is still missing, but what he wrote in the months before his death, and what other workers eventually confirmed, paints a picture of Portland's underground that contradicts every official map, every history book, and every guided tour you have ever taken. So why did the city ignore him for 40 years? And what was really down there? This is what he saw. Before we go any further, hit that subscribe button. We dig into the stories that cities themselves try to keep buried, and there is a lot more coming. If you make it to the end of this one, you will understand why some doors should never have been bricked over. Earl Whitcomb was born in Salem, Oregon in 1932. His father worked the railroads. His mother taught grade school. By all accounts, he was a quiet boy who preferred his own company and had a memory that nobody in the family could explain. He could recite the layout of any building he walked through after one visit. He could draw the route from his school to his grandmother's house in Eugene, 3 blocks at a time from memory, when he was 9 years old. He served 2 years in Korea. He came back, married a woman named Doris, and took a job with the Portland Bureau of Public Works in 1959. The job was simple on paper: inspect the sewer lines, document structural damage, report obstructions, move on. But Earl noticed things the other workers ignored. The Portland sewer system, according to every public record, was built in stages between 1865 and the 1920s. The earliest tunnels were brick. The newer sections used concrete. The maps the city handed out to new hires showed a tidy grid that followed the street layout above. Easy to navigate, easy to repair. Earl's first week on the job, he was sent into a section under what is now downtown to inspect a reported leak. The map showed a single line running north to south with 2 service junctions. What he found was a chamber the size of a small church, with vaulted brick ceilings that arched up to a keystone marked with a symbol he did not recognize. The chamber had 8 side passages. The map showed 2. He reported the discrepancy to his supervisor that afternoon. The supervisor told him the older maps were unreliable and that he should just patch the leak and move on. Earl patched the leak, but he wrote down what he saw, and he kept writing for the next 4 decades. The first thing that bothered him was the brickwork itself. Portland sewers built in the 1880s were, according to the records, laid by Irish and Chinese labourers using locally fired clay brick. The brick was uneven, the mortar was thick, and the work showed the marks of hand labour. Earl had seen plenty of it on the upper levels. It was rough but honest. What he found in the deeper sections was different. The brick down there was uniform. Every piece was the same dimension, the same colour, the same density. The mortar lines were so thin that in some places he could not slide a knife blade between them. The arches were perfect. The keystones were carved with patterns. Earl spent 6 months trying to find a record of who had laid that brick. He searched the city archives. He talked to retired engineers. He even wrote to a brick manufacturer in Pennsylvania who had supplied materials for some of the early Portland construction. Nobody could tell him where the brick came from. Nobody had records of any crew laying it. According to the city, those tunnels did not exist. By 1965, Earl had mapped over 2 miles of passages that appeared on no official document. He had photographed iron doors that were sealed shut and had no hinges he could identify. He had measured chambers that were too large to be drainage rooms and had no apparent function in any sewer system he had ever read about. His supervisors stopped responding to his reports. He kept working. He kept writing. In the spring of 1968, Earl was inspecting a section near the waterfront when his flashlight caught something in a side passage that he had walked past at least 20 times. The wall, which he had always assumed was solid brick, had a seam in it. The seam was almost invisible. But on that particular morning the light hit it at an angle that made it stand out. He spent 3 hours that day, on his own time, working at the seam with a small chisel from his toolkit. The brick moved. Behind it was an opening. Earl crawled through. What he found on the other side, according to the notes he left behind, changed the way he understood the city he had been working under for almost 10 years. The space was a room. The floor was tiled with a stone he could not identify. The walls had been plastered, and the plaster had once been painted, though most of the colour had faded to a pale wash of blue and gold. There was a high arched window in one wall, except the window was buried behind packed dirt and stone. There was no glass left, but the frame was intact, and the frame was made of a dark metal that he could not scratch with his chisel. In the centre of the room, embedded in the floor, was a circular pattern made of inlaid stones. The pattern was geometric. Earl drew it in his notebook that night and showed it to a librarian at the Multnomah County Library the next week. She said she had seen similar patterns in books about old European cathedrals and in photographs of buildings from places like Tashkent and Samarkand. She did not understand why such a pattern would be under a sewer in Portland. Earl asked her if she knew what civilization built things like this. She said she did not. He asked her if any of the major books on Portland's history mentioned anything like it. She said no. He went back to work. He kept the location to himself. Over the next decade, Earl found more rooms. He found staircases that descended into water-filled chambers he could not safely explore. He found doorways that had been bricked over from the outside, suggesting that someone had wanted to seal off whatever was beyond them. He found a corridor with a slight downward grade that ran for what he estimated was 400 feet, before it ended in a wall of packed clay and rubble, as if a collapse had been engineered to block further travel. He photographed everything. He catalogued everything. He labelled his notebooks by date and section, and he made carbon copies of his reports and kept those copies in a strongbox in his garage. One entry from 1972 describes a section of corridor about a half-mile inland from the Willamette River, where Earl found what he called the wash line. The wash line was a horizontal band that ran along the brick at roughly chest height for as far as he could follow the passage. Below the line, the brick was clean and intact. Above the line, the brick was darker, eroded, and in places eaten away as if by long exposure to standing mud. Earl wrote that the line was perfectly level. He measured it in 12 different spots over a stretch of 300 yards and found the variation was less than half an inch. Whatever had filled that corridor with mud had filled it to exactly the same height across the entire run. He could think of no natural process that would leave a mark that uniform. He could think of no construction reason for it either. He simply recorded what he saw and moved on. Another entry from the summer of 1974 describes a wooden beam set into the ceiling of a chamber under what is now the Old Town district. The beam was darkened with age, but it was structurally sound. Earl took a small splinter of it and sent it to a friend who worked at a lumber yard. The friend told him the wood was old-growth Douglas fir, which was not unusual for the Pacific Northwest, but that the tool marks on the beam were not the marks of any sawmill he recognized. The cuts were clean and straight, but they showed no signs of either hand sawing or the circular blade marks that became standard after the 1850s. The friend could not say how the beam had been milled. He suggested it might have been imported. Earl wrote in the margin of that entry in his small careful hand that no shipping records for the period mentioned milled timber arriving in Portland from anywhere outside the region. A third entry from October of 1976 describes a metal fitting Earl found set into the wall of a passage near what is now Pioneer Courthouse Square. The fitting was a bracket of some kind mounted at shoulder height with a shape that suggested it had once held something, a lamp possibly, or a hook. The metal was the colour of dull silver and showed no sign of rust despite being in a damp environment for what Earl assumed was at least a century. He took a small file to a corner of the bracket on a return visit and tried to remove a sample. The file did not bite. He tried a harder file. The file did not bite. He gave up after 2 visits and wrote that the metal was harder than any tool steel he had access to. His co-workers thought he was eccentric. Most of them did not go into the deeper sections at all. The work was unpleasant, the air was bad, and there were stretches where the radio would not reach the surface. By the late 1970s, Earl was one of only 2 or 3 workers in the entire bureau who would willingly take the deeper assignments. That was when he started noticing the other thing. The deeper sections, the ones that did not appear on any map, were not built for water. The slopes were wrong. The drainage angles were wrong. There were no gutters along the floors. There were no overflow basins. The whole layout was designed for foot traffic, for people. Earl realized sometime in the winter of 1979 that he was not walking in a sewer. He was walking in the buried street level of an older city. This is the claim that put him at odds with everyone he tried to talk to about it. The official history of Portland says that the city was founded in 1845. The blocks were laid out by Asa Lovejoy and Francis Pettygrove. The famous coin flip that named the city took place in 1845 at the Overton claim. The earliest buildings were wood. Brick construction came later, in the 1860s and 1870s. Anything underground was either a basement, a service tunnel for the railroads, or part of the so-called Shanghai tunnels, which were used in the late 19th century for moving goods and, according to legend, for kidnapping sailors. There is no official record of any city existing on the site of Portland before 1845. Earl spent the last 20 years of his career trying to find one. He found newspaper articles from the 1890s that mentioned the old foundations being uncovered during construction projects. He found a piece from 1903 about a basement excavation that ran into what the reporter called vaulted brick chambers of considerable age and unknown origin. He found a 1912 letter from a contractor named McAllister to the City Planning Office complaining that the existing underground structures in a section near Burnside were of such quality of construction and such depth, below the present grade, that further investigation seems prudent before continuing. The City Planning Office, according to its own records, never investigated. Earl tried to bring all of this to the attention of the Oregon Historical Society in 1984. He wrote a letter explaining what he had found, attached copies of his photographs, and proposed a meeting. He received a polite response thanking him for his interest and informing him that the Society's resources were committed to other projects at the time. There was no follow-up. He tried again in 1991. This time he wrote to a professor of architectural history at Portland State University. The professor was interested enough to meet him for coffee. They met 3 times. After the 3rd meeting, the professor stopped returning his calls. Earl never found out why. By the mid-1990s, Earl was approaching retirement. His health was not good. The decades of working in confined spaces with poor air quality had damaged his lungs. He had developed a tremor in his right hand that made writing difficult. His wife Doris, who had been ill for several years, died in 1997. He kept working. In 2000, he documented something that even he hesitated to write down. He was inspecting a section under what is now the Pearl District, in a passage that the city maps did not show. He had been in this passage twice before, years apart, and on both previous visits he had noticed that the air was unusually dry and that there was a faint mineral smell that he could not identify. On the 3rd visit he found a small opening in the wall that had not been there before, or that he had not noticed before. He could not say with certainty. The opening led to a room. The room had a low ceiling and a flagstone floor. On the floor, against the far wall, was a heap of what appeared to be construction debris, brick fragments, broken stone, and pieces of plaster. But on top of the heap, lying as if it had been placed there deliberately, was a single object. It was a coin. Earl picked it up. He turned it over in his hand. The coin was made of a yellowish metal that he assumed was bronze or brass. It was the size of an American silver dollar, but heavier. One side showed a profile of a man's face. The man wore a kind of crown or headpiece that Earl had never seen in any history book. The other side showed a building with multiple domes and what appeared to be a star above it. The coin had no date. It had no writing in any alphabet Earl recognized. He brought the coin home. He showed it to the librarian he had spoken to in 1968, who was still working at the same branch. She did not know what it was. She referred him to a numismatist in Seattle. He sent photographs to the numismatist. The numismatist replied that the coin did not match any known issuance from any government he could identify. He asked Earl to bring the coin in person. Earl drove to Seattle in October of 2000. He carried the coin in his pocket. He met with the numismatist for 2 hours. He left the coin with him, against his better judgment, because the numismatist said he wanted to consult with a colleague who specialized in unidentified currency. 2 weeks later, the numismatist called Earl and told him that the coin had been stolen from his office. The office had not been broken into. The lock had not been forced. The coin had simply been removed from a locked drawer in a locked room. The numismatist apologized. He offered to reimburse Earl for the value of the coin, although he admitted he had no way to assess that value. Earl told him to keep his money. He drove home that afternoon and never went back to Seattle again. He wrote about the coin in his notebook that evening. The entry, according to people who later read the notebook, was 3 pages long. It included a detailed drawing of both sides of the coin and an extensive description of the metal, the weight, and the markings. Earl retired from the Portland Bureau of Public Works in March of 2002. He was 70 years old. He had worked for the Bureau for 43 years. At his retirement luncheon, his co-workers presented him with a watch. He thanked them and went home. That evening, he packed up everything he had ever written, every photograph he had taken, every map he had drawn, and he drove to the home of a local historian named Margaret Holloway. Margaret Holloway had written several books about Portland's underground history, including one that touched on the Shanghai tunnels. She and Earl had corresponded a few times over the years. She had taken his observations seriously, even when she could not always confirm them. Earl handed her the entire collection in a cardboard box. He told her he was finished. He told her she could do with the material whatever she thought was right. He told her one more thing before he left. He told her that he had stopped going into the deeper sections in 1999. He told her there had been an incident he had never written down. He told her he was not going to write it down now, but he said that whatever was under Portland was not finished. He said it was still there. He said he had heard something. Margaret asked him what he had heard. Earl said, "Voices." Then he walked out of her house and drove home. Margaret Holloway sat with that cardboard box for the next 16 years. She read through Earl's notebooks. She examined his photographs. She tried several times to find a publisher who would take the material seriously. She had no success. The mainstream historians she contacted dismissed the work as the product of an overactive imagination. The fringe publishers who showed interest wanted to sensationalize it in ways she felt would betray Earl's careful documentation. When Earl died in 2018, Margaret decided she had to do something with the material before she also passed on. She was 82 years old. She began contacting researchers who worked outside the academic mainstream, people who studied buried architecture, people who studied the so-called mud flood theories, people who looked at the strange uniformity of 19th century brick construction around the world and asked questions that nobody in the universities wanted to answer. It was through this network that the contents of Earl Whitcomb's notebooks began to circulate. The most striking element of what Earl documented is not any single discovery. It is the pattern across all of his observations. The unexplained chambers, the brick of impossible quality, the arched windows buried behind dirt, the geometric floor patterns that matched architectural traditions from places thousands of miles away. The corridors that ran for hundreds of feet beneath a city that was supposedly only 150 years old at the time of his earliest entries. If Earl was right, Portland sits on top of something else, something older, something that the historical record does not account for. And Portland is not unique. In the years since Earl's notebooks began to circulate, researchers have documented similar patterns in dozens of cities across North America. Sealed-off basements in Sacramento, buried first floors in Boston, brick vaults in Seattle that have no recorded builder, tunnels under Manhattan that appear on no official map. The pattern repeats, the same uniform brick, the same arched construction, the same chambers with no apparent function in the systems they are now part of. In Sacramento, the official explanation is that the city raised its street level by 10 to 14 feet in the 1860s in response to repeated flooding from the American River. The story is that merchants jacked up their buildings, filled in the old street with dirt and rubble, and continued business on the new grade. It is a clean story. The trouble is that the buildings that supposedly got raised showed no signs of having been jacked. The lower floors, when they are accessed today through the basement tours, have intact plaster, intact wooden floors, and in some cases, intact furniture. They look less like the bottom floors of buildings that were lifted and more like the original ground floors of a city that was buried. In Seattle, the same pattern. The official story is the Great Fire of 1889 destroyed the downtown and the city was rebuilt at a higher grade. The buried sidewalks and storefronts that tourists walk through today are presented as a charming consequence of that rebuild. But the buried sections include vaulted brickwork that matches no contemporary construction, glass skylights set into the original sidewalks that suggest the lower level was meant to be lived in rather than abandoned, and architectural details that nobody in 1889 had any reason to include in what was supposedly a temporary lower level scheduled for burial. The pattern that researchers note across these cities is not the existence of buried sections. The existence of buried sections is well documented. The pattern is the explanation. Every city has a different official story: fire, flood, public health reform, street grade adjustment. Each story is local, each story is plausible on its own, but when you stack them together and compare what is actually buried under each of these cities, the buried structures are remarkably consistent. The same brickwork, the same arches, the same scale, as if the same builders had been at work across all of them in a period that the official histories do not acknowledge. Earl was not aware of most of this. He worked in Portland. He read what he could find about Portland. He never travelled to Seattle or Sacramento or any of the other cities. What he documented in Portland matches what other people, working separately, have documented elsewhere. Either every one of these workers is wrong in exactly the same way, or there is something about the architectural record of 19th century North America that does not fit the story we have been told. The theory that has emerged from researchers who take this evidence seriously is sometimes called the Tartaria hypothesis. The name comes from a region of Central Asia that appeared on European maps from the 16th through the 18th centuries, and then mysteriously disappeared from official cartography in the 19th. The theory suggests that there was a global civilization predating the one we are taught about, whose architecture, infrastructure, and cultural reach were systematically erased from the historical record. You do not have to accept the full theory to find Earl's documentation interesting. You only have to ask the simpler question: where did the brick come from? Who laid it? Why are there rooms designed for foot traffic beneath a city that supposedly never had a previous level? Why did every institution Earl approached refuse to investigate? The official answer is that Earl was mistaken, that what he saw was old construction misinterpreted, that the chambers were drainage features, that the brick was just brick, that the coin, if it ever existed, was a curiosity or a fake. The trouble with this answer is that Earl was not the only sewer worker who reported these things. In 2019, a former Portland Public Works employee named Tom Risker gave an interview to an independent journalist. Risker had worked for the Bureau from 1984 to 2011. He had known Earl personally. He confirmed on the record that the deeper sections of the Portland Underground contained structures that did not appear on any map. He said he had personally walked through 3 of the chambers Earl had described in his notebooks. He said he had seen the geometric floor patterns. He said he had seen the arched windows buried behind dirt. He also said something that Earl had never written down. Risker said that in 1995 the Bureau quietly transferred a section of the underground maps to a different department. He did not know which department. He only knew that after the transfer, certain assignments stopped being available to regular workers. The deeper sections that Earl was still going into at that time were inspected by a separate crew that the regular workers never saw. Risker said he was told, when he asked about it, that the assignments were classified for safety reasons. Risker gave the interview in February of 2019. The journalist who recorded it lost the original audio files in what was described as a hard drive failure 3 weeks later. Risker himself stopped responding to follow-up requests. The transcript that survived was reconstructed from notes. Margaret Holloway died in 2021. The cardboard box that Earl gave her was inherited by her niece. The niece, according to public statements she has made, donated the materials to a private research foundation whose name she has not disclosed. The notebooks and photographs are no longer publicly accessible. What is publicly accessible is a series of articles, blog posts, and amateur documentaries built from copies that Margaret made before she handed the originals over. The copies are incomplete. Some of the photographs are blurry, some of the diagrams are illegible, but enough remains to confirm the general outline of what Earl claimed to have seen. There is a final entry in one of the surviving notebook copies that has caused more debate than any other piece of his work. The entry is undated, although the surrounding entries suggest it was written sometime in 2001, shortly before Earl retired. The entry describes a room he found in a section he refused to identify on any map. The room had a flagstone floor and a low ceiling, similar to others he had documented. But this room had something the others did not. On the far wall, etched into the stone, was a single line of writing. Earl did not recognize the alphabet. He copied the characters into his notebook with careful precision. He spent the following year showing the copied line to anyone he could find who studied ancient or unusual languages. Nobody could identify it. In 2020, a graduate student in comparative linguistics working from a copy of the page that had been shared online suggested that the script bore a passing resemblance to a writing system used in Central Asia between the 8th and 12th centuries. The student emphasized that the resemblance was not conclusive, and that without seeing the original carving in person, no firm identification was possible. The original carving, of course, is in a passage that nobody can now locate. Earl took its location with him. So what do we make of all of this? A careful, methodical sewer worker, 43 years of documentation, photographs, diagrams, written reports, confirmation from at least one other employee. Records from the late 19th and early 20th centuries that mention unexplained underground structures. A coin that vanished from a locked drawer. A line of writing in an alphabet that does not appear in any standard reference. There are two ways to read this. The first way is to accept the official line. Earl was a dedicated employee who saw old construction and interpreted it through the lens of his own private theories. The chambers were utility rooms. The brick was unremarkable. The coin was a souvenir from somewhere. The writing was graffiti. The patterns he saw across decades were patterns he wanted to see. The second way is to take Earl seriously, to accept that what he documented was real, to ask why no official investigation was ever launched, to wonder why two separate employees, decades apart, described the same impossible architecture and were both ignored by the institutions that should have wanted to know. The second way leads to harder questions. If there is an older city beneath Portland, where did it come from? Who built it? When was it buried, and why? Why is there no record of it in the histories we have been given? Why does the same pattern appear under so many other cities? What does it mean that the people who try to investigate it tend to be dismissed or have their evidence go missing or simply stop returning calls? These are not questions that this video can answer. These are questions that Earl Whitcomb spent his life asking in private, in the dark, with a notebook and a flashlight, while the city above him went about its business and pretended that nothing was wrong. He died without an answer. But he left the questions, and the questions are still there, and the brick is still in the ground, and somewhere in a private collection there is a cardboard box with 43 years of one man's careful, patient, and very inconvenient observations. There is one more detail worth knowing. In the months before he died, Earl spoke twice with a man who runs a small independent archive of regional history materials. The man asked Earl what he believed, at the end of all of it, about the structures he had spent his life documenting. Earl thought about the question for a long time before he answered. He said he did not know who built them. He said he was not sure when. He said he had stopped trying to fit what he had seen into the categories that the books gave him. But he said one thing that the archivist wrote down word for word, and that has been repeated by everyone who has worked with the surviving copies of his notebooks. Earl said that the city he had spent his career inspecting was, in his opinion, the second city. He said the first city was still down there. He said he did not think it had been built by anyone we have names for. If even one of those observations is correct, then the city you live in is not the city you think it is. And the history you have been taught is not the history that actually happened. Earl Whitcomb believed he had found the evidence. The institutions he tried to share it with disagreed. You can decide for yourself. The next video on screen takes you to another city where another worker in another tunnel saw something he was never supposed to see. We are not done digging.